You're right.
Okay, so thank you all for being here, and thank you also to all of the speakers that have already presented and the work you're doing in this space to ensure the ethical development and deployment of artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. So with that, I'll introduce myself and share a little bit about my story and what I hope to accomplish being a part of AIWS and the launch of the Common Good Digital Framework. So my background is in computer engineering and international security studies. I sought my degree in computer engineering because I really believe that cybersecurity is national security and consequently international security, and coupling that degree with the political science gives me greater insight and understanding of the convergence of threats by emerging technology. In 2017, after working on an autonomous weapon, a text-run weapons and sensor system, I then pursued research into cybersecurity and AI in weapons at the United Nations office in Geneva, where I met and discussed with ambassadors, NGO leaders, security experts, and advocates on these topics. And then when I returned to Boston, I conducted research right here at the Belfer Center on cybersecurity, specifically on the Information Sharing Project. But then I returned to Geneva for the AI for Good conference. I don't know if anyone else is aware of that. It's about advancing AI to pursue the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN. They hold an annual conference in Geneva. And this is really where my inspiration and motivation to be an ethical AI and cybersecurity advocate stems from. It was at this conference that I explored what AI and good data processing can do in healthcare and migration and refugee scenarios, and in preventing and responding to violence. And, oh, sorry, can you?
Yep.
Thank you. Two slides. There we go. One more slide. Thanks. So what AI can do in these sectors like healthcare, refugee scenarios, and in preventing and responding to violence and natural disasters, and connecting the world while at the same time really recognizing the threat it poses, like we've discussed today, to society in terms of exploiting individuals' right to privacy, exacerbating existing bias, infiltrating our critical infrastructure as we individually in our governments have become more and more dependent on the cloud, internet-connected networks, and eroding IHL and IHRL when our weapon systems act without oversight or accountability, human oversight or accountability. So this is when I decided to take a deep technical dive into how these systems work, studying machine learning, and I also pursued research at Northeastern's Global Resilience Institute on the critical infrastructure network problem. Through this work and these experiences and my own experience of being hacked and my sensitive personal and financial data being leaked, I found my passion for privacy, computer networks, and ethical artificial intelligence, and now I work as a developer at Dataductus, which is a software and consulting firm in the network and cloud space. We work with major service providers to help them to automate and migrate to the cloud. But here I launched the diversity and inclusion campaign to both educate and create a platform for engineers to share about mindful developing, making sure our work is not only accessible for all, but also we're dealing with people's data as we're providing services to telecommunication businesses, and thus security has to come first. And that's another pillar of that campaign, that we're ensuring that what we develop and who we develop for does not have unforeseen consequences for the secure passage of information. So all of that has brought me to the Boston Global Forum, and specifically the AIWS Innovation Network, and I'm incredibly humbled and grateful for the opportunity to present to you today about an initiative I'm launching with the BGF and AIWS. So thank you to Tuan and Governor Dukakis for your support in this endeavor. And we can move along to the next slide. So as an engineer, I see firsthand how computing power and advancements in machine learning has great benefits for society, and I'm by no means against the development of such technology, but also, as we talked about today, we can identify the existing and emerging threat it poses if left unregulated, and if there's not mindful development. So specifically, I'm concerned with the following. They're all interconnected and interwoven. But I kind of broke it down like this. And so we have the advancement and integration of AI into our systems, and particularly when they're integrated into our governance systems, they pose a significant threat to exacerbating existing bias and violating our human rights. Like we also talked about today, we've seen how AI algorithms when they're used to determine prison sentences, there's a disproportionate incarceration rate for blacks than whites, for example. And then the expanding critical infrastructure and the number of devices connected to the internet expands the threat landscape, making our states more vulnerable to attacks. The private and the public sectors are rapidly adapting to the cloud and cloud computing environment for information storage. The internet is being used to manage electric power generation and water levels through SCADA, and the distribution for networks, food, water, energy, transportation, healthcare, and financial services also depend heavily on the internet and information technology. Cisco estimates that there will be more than 50 billion connected devices by the year 2020. And like was said, smart refrigerators are now the back door into the energy grid. And there was a botnet, for example, in 2016 that reached more than 160 countries and nearly took down the internet in the eastern part of the US. And that was amassed by exploiting vulnerabilities in closed-circuit television cameras and routers that were connected to the internet. So we can see as the more devices there are, that threat landscape increases. And then greatly linked to this is the ever-increasing amount of personal data that we're giving up to private corporations without knowing how this data is being shared or protected, as well as the increasing ways that governments are surveilling us. And then lastly, of course, as touched upon today, the weapon systems and the integration of AI into there are, of course, of great concern, and that technology that's being implemented. Next slide, please. So these are like current existing problems. We saw the Ukraine power grid went down twice in 2015 and 2016. That was a cyber attack. We talked a lot about the facial recognition use in China. They have overestimated 200 million surveillance cameras. 2016, 3 billion Yahoo accounts were hacked in one of the biggest breaches. And we also can see those the AI algorithms that are being used for facial recognition. For example, a study coming out of MIT really showed the disproportional error rates for people with darker skin tones. And if we're now implementing those into law enforcement, you can see how the existing bias can be exacerbated. Next slide. So, for all these reasons, and also all the reasons we've talked about today, the Common Good Digital Framework will be purposed at identifying both good and poor digital practices to advocate for ethical guidelines, frameworks, and policy. This will allow us to create new norms, raising the sector ethos and benefiting the common good. With this, security and trust can be increased. Next slide, please. And so really the purpose for this Common Good Digital Framework launched through the AIWS with conjunction with the Boston Global Forum is really to bring authoritative knowledge and really raise awareness about these issues and something I like to call cyber literacy. So these things are happening, but people don't always know about them. They're not really sure how data is just being shared pretty recklessly between corporations. And so it really is about raising awareness for the general public. And with that, then being able to generate ethics and practice index design for policymakers. So the whole purpose is to really monitor what's going on in the world and share that information. And so that's the main purpose. And ideally, with this network of people that will be brought into the framework, we'll be able to influence AI and cyber policy. But again, it's really about raising awareness to these key issues to the general public. So the monitoring method, as proposed, is really about following the news, open source resources, taking part in great conversations like today, and just using the minds of everybody to get more information and find out what's going on, as well as, of course, interviewing public and private sector leaders in these fields. Next. So the response method, so in response to identified violations, so when we see that a corporation is being reckless with data, or we see that a government is, surveilling their people unfairly, or integrating an AI algorithm that has been shown to disproportionately attack one subset of people, when there's a lack of regulatory frameworks and there's no commonly agreed norms, When we identify that sort of thing, the CGDF will generate a course of action and policy recommendation by first reaching out to the relevant stakeholders. So that's the violator, but also the experts that we seek to bring into the network. And a policy recommendation will be circulated to all of these stakeholders, first for feedback and review and to generate the policy, and then secondly to encourage corrective action by the offender. It's really important to handle this internally first, as this framework really needs to develop trust in the industry and establish its authority, and it can't do that unless it's working with the different stakeholders. So following that internal disbursement, then there will be a publicly published recommendation without disclosing the names of the violators. The purpose of the publication will be to once again draw public attention to the types of violations already occurring. But finally, if in a later stage no corrective action was pursued, then to really put pressure on these private companies as well as the governments, the CGDF will reveal the names of the perpetrators publicly to be amplified by what we hope to have as a global network and its partners, really adding pressure to these organizations to tighten up their policies. Following slide, please. Next. Thank you. So here's our distribution method. So of course, like as was just mentioned, we'll have internal publications as well as journal publications, and really trying to use social media to spread the reach of this information and have a greater impact. Next slide, please. So the partners in CGDF will be expected to contribute data and evidence when governments and companies violate norms, as well as identify good cybersecurity practices. This is another critical aspect of this campaign, is that we do really want to also identify when organizations are doing a good job and learn from that and share that information. But also in response to violations, partners will join together their resources and platform, serving as change agents and advocates and contributing solutions and recommendations. It's critical to create a network that spans the world and the disciplines, engaging advocates at every level of their career, every level of government, in the academic world, and particularly in the private sector. We need all of these stakeholders involved. Only then can we develop comprehensive solutions to really affect change. So the CGDF will also seek to connect other AIWS leaders and cyber advocates in the world. So that's the whole plan. And then we can talk a little bit about the action plan. So really just comes down to identifying who needs to be involved to handle our communications, outreach, and creating that network of experts and advocates. And again, just bringing in different stakeholders, NGOs, national and international, and of course the scholarly leaders to join the network. So all of you here are certainly invited, and I hope that you will contribute. Following slide, please. And then, of course, also in the private sector, we need to identify industry leaders, policymakers, and the relevant conferences to really spread the word. We will be drafting a report to present at AIWS Summit April 28th and 29th here. And also, of course, we need to develop the rollout plan for the publications and reports, coordinating that action plan with the celebration of Plymouth 400. So that's really all I had today about this initiative, and welcome to feedback, questions, anything like that. Thank you for the opportunity, and that's really all I had to say, so thank you.